As you can see from the program, we have a lot to get through today. We start with 2 keynote speeches. The panel debate will follow the speeches, and at the end of the debate, the panelists would be pleased to answer your questions. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speakers today, Professor Megan Boler and Mr. Evgeny Morozov. Megan Boler is a professor at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. She is the author of a number of books and papers in the field of media literacy. Her current funded research project is Safeguarding Democracies, an interdisciplinary synthesis of digital media studies and the politics of emotion. Professor Boler, now I would like to hand over to you and hear your speech called Beyond Reason, Emotion and Effect in Post-Truth Information Warfare.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks to the Evans Foundation for having me, and especially to Joanna, who's done an incredible job organizing. It's an honor to be here with the best minds in media literacy gathered from many countries. Yesterday, we had people from 14 countries at least. This morning, I invite you to think outside of the box and outside of the rational box. Media literacy has, without doubt, developed best practices in critical thinking and cognitive approaches to analyzing media. But I'm worried that we have overlooked a central and key dimension. We're in the midst of a crisis of post-truth and information warfare. Post-truth targets our emotions more than our rational thought. Thus, I invite you to think creatively with me. How might we understand the roles of emotion and affect in media education? How do we address emotion in media literacy contexts? For the past year, I've been funded by SSHRC, the Canadian Social Science and Humanities Research Council, to synthesize studies of emotion from across all disciplines that are relevant to our political media landscape. And I present some of these new findings today, which I've not presented before. But I have been studying emotion since I was a graduate student in the 1980s, and I've spent the last 10 years studying digital media and democracy and how citizens and activists use social media tools. Today, I'll share interdisciplinary concepts that I think are critical to understanding the complex media environment. In our attention economy, the deluge of data moves so fast and presents so much information, there is simply too much to humanly compute. How do we filter information? Our processes of filtering is as much an affective process as it is a rational one. These affective filters determine which news and messages are salient, while the rest fades into a background blur of bits and bytes. Emotional and affective processes determine which media circulates and which media sticks. What media has salience and valence depends on what Sarah Ahmed calls emotional stickiness within affective economies. The challenge is to understand emotion at all levels of media cycles, in production, in consumption, and in the dynamics of circulation. Thus, we are not simply talking about how journalists use emotion or how photojournalism evokes a particular feeling. We are not just talking about the emotional reactions of a viewer or audience. It's perhaps helpful to think metaphorically, to imagine emotions like blood, a rich substance that contributes meaning to organs of thought, and to envision affect like oxygen, the shared collective feeling that breathes life into information. In ancient Greece, Aristotle emphasized emotion centrally in his analyses of the power of rhetoric. But the Western Enlightenment tradition since Descartes has dismissed emotion and affect, privileging rationality and reason. This bias has indoctrinated us to believe that political actors are primarily rational creatures, and I wonder if that is perhaps not the case. Until the recent emotional turn over the past 30 years, the humanities and social sciences have neglected to study emotion and affect. Meanwhile, the disciplines of cognitive and behavioral psychology, marketing and public relations, and neuroscientists have kept up with the study of emotion. The father of modern propaganda, Edward Bernays, founded much of his dangerous attention to emotion in the wake of modern mass communications in the 1920s. Today, the dangerous understandings of emotion in media is resulting in computational propaganda or micro-targeting. One example being the Trump campaign's use of psychometric profiles to micro-target undecided African-American voters in the 2016 US election by using emotionally provocative disinformation. Another aim of disinformation campaigns is to create affective confusion, to produce so much false information that citizens become apathetic and give up trying to find accurate information. But despite the bad news that we have fallen behind in our understanding of emotion, there's good news, and that is that I believe emotion is more visible than ever in the political mediascape, allowing us a chance to catch up. PostTruth opens the door for us to see the role of emotion and affect. PostTruth was named the 2017 Word of the Year by the UK and US Oxford English Dictionaries due to a 2,000% increase in the frequency of its usage during 2016. Post-truth is defined as circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than our appeals to emotion and personal belief. In simpler terms, using emotion rather than facts to evaluate or make claims to truth. Post-truth has received a vast amount of focus and attention. There were 3 books published by popular presses on post-truth in 2016. Every day I have a Google alert. Around the globe, there are new university courses and symposium that are announced to help people understand and combat post-truth. Post-truth is referenced in dozens of headlines every day across different countries. At professional journalism conferences, the hottest topic and new areas of study are post-truth, fake news, and fact-checking. Post-truth was in fact used on a number of occasions prior to this period to express concern about governments and news press manipulating public opinion. Journalists used the term to describe the deceptions in the build-up to the US Bush administration's preemptive invasion of Iraq in 2003. In 2005, political satirist Stephen Colbert coined the word truthiness. Almost identical to post-truth, truthiness is defined as, quote, the belief in what you feel to be true rather than in what the facts support. After being popularized by the Colbert Report in 2005, truthiness was named Word of the Year in 2006. But we've just finished studying this, and truthiness appeared in very few news articles, whereas post-truth is constantly in headlines and in news articles. Truthiness reflected the increasing public mistrust of media and politicians in North America during the Bush administration as a result of the lies and deceptions surrounding the illegal preemptive invasion of Iraq on the basis of false evidence. We thus see that there was concern about emotion defining truth even earlier in this century. To contextualize post-truth, allow me to insert here in passing a description of what I'm calling spectacular realism, drawing on 2 French media theorists, Baudrillard and Guy Debord. Post-truth, I suggest, represents a shift in which politics and news media adopt the manipulations and misrepresentations that drive advertising and marketing. I call this media landscape spectacular realism, which enables news media to maintain audiences and profit through glossy and spectacular presentations of news. Realism derives from the visual effect of digital data. Most information that we encounter is communicated through digital platforms appears equally real. We have been primed for this realist aesthetic of digital media by reality TV, which, like today's news, teaches mass publics to take pleasure in the production of reality for the sake of drama. This blurring of reality and drama dovetails with the rise of infotainment, information packaged as entertainment. Spectacular realism is the favored aesthetic form of post-truth. The increased use of post-truth in 2016 is directly connected to Brexit and to the 2016 US presidential race and its aftermath. An analysis of the rhetoric used in the Brexit campaign illustrates how emotions were central to the populist uprising. One marketing director noted that, quote, "The Leave campaign mobilized metaphors so potent that they sidestepped rational debate and spoke directly to raw human emotion. Leave tapped into a deep metaphorical well of theft and loss linked to powerful emotions of fear and anger." In response to the emotionality of post-truth, the New York Times and the Washington Post both adopted anti-emotional, what I call anti-emotional subheads on their mastheads, invoking Enlightenment rhetoric. For the New York Times, they took out an ad in the New York Times, a full-page ad that said truth and their commitment to the truth, claiming that they had the truth. And their masthead says, "Subscribe to reason, not rhetoric." And the Washington Post is running still a masthead that says, "Democracy dies in darkness." Meanwhile, of course, ironically, and to be expected though, these newspapers are also profiting from the spectacular realism of what's known as the Trump bump. I'll now illustrate the ways in which emotionality has become visible in the media and political landscape. First, trust. Across parties, trust in government, this is in the United States context, which is where I'm from and where I've been following the news most particularly in terms of post-truth. Across parties, trust in government institutions, including media, is on the decline. And it's a shocking level of decline at the moment. Given the widespread lack of trust in traditional news media, as we were just being informed, readers trust the news circulated by Facebook friends above all else. Polarization between parties is dominated by extraordinarily strong negative affects of one party towards the other, as I'll illustrate. And the view from the left and the view from the right, in the case of the United States election, each political side accused the other of being overly emotional. On the view from the left, they accuse, the left accuses the right of being driven by emotion rather than fact, and you see a headline in the other, after the election, some universities set up crying rooms for people who were incredibly shocked and upset by the results of the election, and the Breitbart News spoke of it as triggered students across the country meltdown in response to Trump victory. Another way in which we see this emotionality is in terms of filter bubbles, of course. Thanks to algorithmic logics, we tend to be exposed only to views similar to our own, which reinforces a distorted sense that most of the world shares our opinions and contributes to this polarization. Just recently, I discovered these two scholarly studies, two different studies on emotion and news, which were actually reported in popular press. So the first one was reported in Scientific American, and the other one was in the New York Times. And these scholarly studies document this role of emotion. The first claims that they've identified a way to measure zeitgeist, and in this case, they claim that they have identified a global zeitgeist of doom and gloom. This headline speaks to the US, but they are actually based in the Netherlands and were a multi-country study. The other study is using sentiment analysis, which is how people are often analyzing emotion in Twitter feeds, for example, and they claim to have discovered how emotion that is morally coded moves much more quickly through Twitter. So in summary, it isn't the case that there are more emotions in politics now, but there is increased visibility and awareness of emotions and affect in both popular and scholarly culture. And in scholarship, this is known as the affective turn. So here I just want to share a few concepts that I think might be useful to media education and media literacy. And again, I'm asking you to think with me and think outside of the box about how we can make these sorts of concepts useful in our work. And after this, I'll briefly talk about some uses of media for democracy and then close. So the first concept I want to share, and these concepts that I find helpful are primarily from affect theory and a field called feminist politics of emotion. Media education does, for example, address emotional response of the viewer and emotionality in photojournalism, but I'm suggesting we need understandings of the socio-cultural and political force of emotion, and particularly of emotion or affect that is collectively experienced. So I find very helpful the work of a sociologist, Arlie Hochschild, and one of her concepts is that of deep stories. And these are defined as deeply felt cultural myths, such as the American dream, that are culturally specific, widely shared myths and narratives that tap into strong emotions. So in many contexts, the deep story is, if you work hard, you will achieve the American dream. And these are experienced, and there would be different myths, obviously, in different contexts, though in the many different nations in which I have taught, I find there's some version of this American dream at play. But these deep stories are experienced as felt truths. And Hochschild has a very interesting analysis of how it's a desire for the American dream that motivates Trump supporters, and the sense that there was an African-American president and that people of color have cut in line for that American dream and have taken away their dream. And I think that's similar in Brexit. A second concept I find useful that I'm trying to develop with a graduate student who's especially bright is of affective feedback loops. And one example of this is our relationship to social media. Within a filter bubble, for example, there's an affective feedback loop between the experience first of posting our opinion, then the reciprocity of our post being liked, then we experience confirmation bias through exposure to other views with which we agree, which cannot help but produce pleasure. Seeing more of ourselves in our emotional reality confirmed, we keep coming back, we post more of the same in this circular way, reinscribing affectively pleasurable identities and polarization in an endless loop. The notion of affective economies from a scholar, Sarah Ahmed. Like feeling rules, affective economies reveal the intersection of the personal with the socio-political. Circulating through this economy, emotions that stick become named and shared, transforming our private experience into a public exchange of meaning. I'm not going to detail these, but these are concepts from different disciplines, actually information systems and advertising, that are also trying to describe emotion that is collective or emotion that is a dynamic relationship between the individual and the environment. So not emotion that's only in the individual, not emotion that's only in the media, but emotion that circulates through the environment. And a final term I want to share from Hochschild is feeling rules. These are social norms that tell us what, when, why, how, and how much we should feel in any given situation. So, for example, boys don't cry, women are emotional. Those are examples of feeling rules. Feeling rules are also quite visible in the political landscape. The emotional terrain of liberals can be emblematized by the protest sign, "Love Trumps Hate." For conservatives, a trending sentiment included the call to make America great again. This is an example from the right, calling the left liberal crybabies and calling attention to that emotion as a negative aspect. And finally, we see the feeling rules on different sides of the fence, different sides of the polarized partisan blocks in terms of deplorable lives matter on the one side and Black Lives Matter to others. So I'm hoping that these critical concepts might help us develop cutting-edge media literacy for navigating an era of post-truth. Finally, I just want to note a few points of hope, and I think the people preceding me mentioned some of the uses of digital and social media that do provide this. But I spent about, I had 2 3-year funded studies. The first to look at how this was prior to YouTube, 2003 to 2004 to 2007, how people were using digital media for dissent against, dissent particularly against traditional media and the narratives during the invasion of Iraq. So I was looking at bloggers, looking at people who were using satire, looking at people who produced memes, what we now call memes or viral videos, but that was prior to YouTube, so we had to track how these were being produced. And it was very inspiring to see these uses of digital media. I've just noted here 5 key ways that I think digital media is used for dissent importantly, and those include of course, producing alternative media, which includes a pluralism and diversity of voices that we don't always see in traditional media. Counter-surveillance, or what Steve Mann calls surveillance, looking back at those who are looking at us. And an example of that would be videotaping or recording police brutality and being able to post that or use that in a court case, for example. Using social media when I studied how Occupy activists in the Occupy movement were using digital tools, they were clearly using, Facebook was the primary tool, they were using the quote-unquote the master's tools for their social movements, and they were well aware of the limitations of those, and when they had to have private meetings, of course they did those face-to-face. Folks are savvy, but these tools are proving incredibly useful to social movements. And of course, for dialogue and debate, and finally, being able to share openly and widely. Briefly, I just wanted to share with you some of how people who are using these digital tools talk about the value of that. And here, a blogger describes that this practice allows them to feel a level of citizen participation. You have a voice as well as a vote. Instead of just going and pulling a lever and being an anonymous number, you actually contribute something to the debate. Another says, I'm not just attempting to influence people while they're online, I'm attempting to influence them for the rest of their lives. And I find that the commitment of people using and engaging this is absolutely phenomenal. And in fact, much of this does translate to offline action. I think it's quite important to notice that there was for a long time concern that the online activity took away from offline activity, but there is absolutely really no evidence of that in the studies that I have read and that I have done. So in conclusion, I just want to say that times of crisis require radical and creative solutions, and I think thinking outside of the box, I've tried to demonstrate that emotions are what make things matter, and I've now invited and challenged media education to make emotion and affect matter for the sake of preserving humanity. Thank you.